So we're going to go into context now, which is one of my favourite things about Ozymandias. So one of the interesting things about this, I know I said it's a Victorian poem. It's actually technically slightly before Victoria, but I always call the 1800s Victorian. So yeah, don't technically call it Victorian. I think Victoria was around 1830 she came to power. But yeah, you can call it 19th century, which means the 1800s. So it's written in 1817, published in 1818, and it's quite interesting. So Shelley, I don't know why he does this, but he's a really interesting guy generally. So if you're interested in him or his ideas, it's worth reading more about him. He's a really cool person. He died in such a sad way. He was really young. I think he was about 26, maybe 28 or something. And he died in a shipwreck in a storm just by random. So yeah, he had a really dramatic, very short life. But he's always challenging his friends to competitions about writing poems or stories, which in some ways is kind of like a bit arrogant, I think. But in other ways, it gave rise to so many amazing pieces of literature, not just by him, but by other people who were his contemporaries. So other writers at the time that were just really, into writing and took up the challenge. So Ozymandias is the result of a writing competition that Percy Shelley had with Horace Smith, who's another famous poet. Definitely, in my eyes, not as good as Shelley, but, a very well-regarded poet. So there's two versions of this poem, which is really kind of mind-blowing because it's the same subject and the same idea. And and they're trying to compete for the point of the poem. So I feel like reading Horace Smith's version gives you a bit more of an idea of the central message or concept of the poem Ozymandias, because they're both sonnets, they're both called Ozymandias, and they're both on the same thing. But there are differences as well. So if you have time, I recommend doing a bit of an analysis here, like a comparison and a contrast between Ozymandias by Shelley and Ozymandias by Horace Smith. This is not something you have to do for your AQA poetry, so it's like an extra exercise to help you understand it in context a bit more. But I would really recommend doing it. I'm going to just read you Smith's poem as a contrast to the original Ozymandias. In Egypt's sandy silence, all alone stands a gigantic leg, which far off throws the only shadow that the desert knows. I am great Ozymandias, saith the throne, king of kings. This mighty city shows the wonders of my hand. The city's gone, naught but the leg remaining to disclose the sight of this forgotten Babylon. We wonder, and some hunter may express wonder like ours, when through the wilderness where London stood, holding the wolf in chance, he meets some fragment huge and stops to guess what powerful but unrecorded race once dwelt in that annihilated place. So personally, for me, the thing that pops out that's really interesting when you read this poem and you contrast it is the idea of looking forward to the future, which Shelley doesn't do. So even though I prefer Shelley's version of the poem, I think the ending of this poem is quite cool, really. So it's like, one day some random person is going to walk across what used to be London and just find a random fragment and try to guess what London used to be and how people used to be when they lived there. So it's about history and time and how things move on and adapt and change. So it's really fascinating, I think. Really interesting perspectives going on there. So a couple of other context points. Ozymandias, like I said, is an ancient Greek name for King Ramesses II, also called Ramesses the Great. And there's this statue of Ramesses in the British Museum. I'm going to actually see if I can find it. I'm just going to pause a second and then copy that picture in here. Yeah, so I've copied that in now. I'll just show it you in a second. But there's an inscription on this statue in the British Museum. It's called Younger Memnon, and it has the inscription, "King of kings am I, Ozymandias. If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works." So it's not quite as brutal as Horace Smith and Shelley make Ozymandias out to be. I actually think he's not quite as evil as they make it seem, but you can see where the idea comes from. I really recommend going to the British Museum if you ever get to go to London. It's one of my absolute favourite places to be in the world. Every time I go to London, I just drag whoever I'm with there and spend hours in it. It's full of really, really fascinating things. So yeah, he's this guy. I'll show him to you. It's a huge picture. Sorry if it doesn't quite fit on your screen. You can see it's a fragment of a large statue, and he's depicted. We can think of it. I mean, this is more history than English. But if you do history, you should be able to analyze sources. So you look at a sculpture or an object from history, and you try and work backwards and sort of piece it together like a puzzle. Like, what can we figure out about it? And the point of this poem is kind of like that. Like I was saying, poems are puzzles, and this is based on a fragment of history. So there's some aspects of Ozymandias here, like his headdress and the way that his beard is perfectly designed, show kind of wealth and attention to detail. There's a few other things to do with, like, his physique. He obviously looks like a strong, healthy, quite powerful person. Personally, I wouldn't interpret his face to seem like it's sneering or cruel. It kind of seems kind of neutral, quite powerful and confident, but personally quite neutral, I would say. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting looking at that and thinking about it. So another thing that's kind of weird about it, that's different from the original Ozymandias to the poem, is this title, King of Kings. It seems very arrogant. I'm the king of all kings. I am the most king of anyone. It sounds a bit excessive, but actually it's just quite a normal title that was given to Persian kings of the Middle East. So it's quite regular, really, for things like this, and it's similar to emperor. In Judaism, it's also used to refer to God in the Bible and refer to Jesus. So some of the readers in Shelley's time might have seen it more biblically than historically. So you can do an analysis, a contextual analysis on the title King of Kings. And you can do layers of interpretation there. You can say, okay, it seems kind of arrogant from a modern perspective, but it was actually quite normal. A lot of Persian kings were called this, and it's similar to emperor. However, for Shelley's audience, which I'm not going to call Victorian, Shelley's 19th century audience, it would have been more kind of maybe something biblical about it. Finally, we've got a little bit on Shelley as a person. You don't need to know this. I always think it's good when you do writers to just see them as a real person rather than just like a random. So I always, with literature, the more you know about the writer, the more you can really enjoy their work, I think. So yeah, with him, I find him a really interesting guy. Like I said before, he was a romantic poet. Some of the poems in this collection actually go more into that in their context, so we'll do more on romantic poetry later. But yeah, romanticism is about power and emotion and energy and humans and how they interact with the natural world, and spirituality as well. So you can see a lot of the themes and ideas of romantic poetry in this particular poem. He's also quite radical with his politics, which you can use to analyze the poem. He likes the idea that powerful structures can be torn down, and if a government is no longer effective, it can be changed and replaced. It's quite a dangerous kind of political belief to have in this time. He was actually kicked out of Cambridge for his religious and political radical beliefs. So he didn't actually get his degree in the end because he was a bit too crazy for this time with his ideas. So you can read more about that if you're interested. I find it really interesting personally.